Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. Today on the show, we've got a guy, and he's the author of Creating Christ. He's also the author of The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, and he is going to interview me today. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to the wonderful James Stevens Valliant.
Well, hello, Michael, and thank you for
Hello.
coming on. And this is a real privilege and honor to be taking your sort of interviewing role in your on your podcast. Quite an honor indeed.
Well, the
And
honor is mine, but I suppose we can go back and forth all day with
we could
that.
let's just have a mutual thank you between us. Last weekend I read a remarkable memoir. Um, the most remarkable story of redemption I've personally ever read. And I have to get that out of the way before I even start asking these questions. I was deeply impressed, and I want everybody to read this book. If you're at all even slightly interested, believe me, you'll be doing yourself a real favor if you read this book. It is both enlightening and inspiring. And that word is so overused, inspiring. This is an inspiring book, ladies and gentlemen. It's called View from a Cage: My Transformation from Convict to Moral Crusader, if I got it right, or
Not quite, but we'll forgive it.
for liberty, right?
Crusader for liberty. Yes.
Thank you. But you'll find that that's exactly what happens. He goes from being a criminal to being a moral crusader, and that's what I want to talk about today. Um, First, before we get into this, Michael, give me your context. Let's locate ourselves in time and place.
Sure.
Where did you grow? Where and when did you grow up and start becoming a criminal?
Well, I grew up in a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. I grew up in Wethersfield, Connecticut, and I grew up in a low-income housing project. Now, it wasn't the type of project you're going to see, in the television and things like that. It was in a suburb, but nonetheless, we were on welfare. We had food stamps. My friends in the neighborhood were in similar situations, and for the town I grew up in, the neighborhood was where the troublemakers were at. We were young. We would be vandalizing, throwing eggs at houses, throwing stuff at cars, spray paint and stuff like that. So that all began at a very, very young age. I wouldn't even begin to know when. I mean, you can see this scar I got right here is because we used to throw rocks at each other. And when I was 5, my 12-year-old from the neighborhood hit me in the face with a rock, because that's just, that's what we did. And no excuses, no nothing. It's, there were kids in the neighborhood. This is the thing I always want to stress, Jim. My friends and I were troublemakers. Yes, there were kids in my neighborhood that weren't. They were just as poor. They, came through, some of them, just as difficult times as we did. They stayed away from us, and we stayed away from them. They were the squares. They were the kids, we didn't want to be around. If anything, we bullied them when we had the chance. And for that matter, the vast majority of kids that I grew up with that got into trouble when we were young grew out of it. I didn't. I just, I kept going. Most of them 17, 18, that was it. Not me.
That is one of the more impressive things about your entire approach, is that you are reluctant to talk about your childhood, your background, your parents, precisely because you insist repeatedly in the book that it's no excuse for your criminal conduct. And that's a remarkable position to take. So frequently people will use it as an excuse, use it as I had no chance, there's no excuse. But the way you just articulated it there, but look, other people made other choices,
Sure.
and even though they came from a poor background. But it wasn't, I want to explore that a little more, because it
Okay.
wasn't merely poverty. It wasn't merely growing up in a project or rough neighborhood that you had to contend with as a young child. It is a really grim story, but I think it is important context. I too am a strong believer in free will and personal responsibility, but I'm also someone who is aware of psychological context and what developmental issues and trauma can do to a person. Could you tell us a little bit about your parents?
I will. It's interesting because I've been accused. I don't want to use accusation. That's a strong word, but it's been suggested to me that I must not have faced my childhood issues because I won't talk about them. But it's quite the opposite. I've dealt with them so thoroughly that I'm perfectly comfortable talking about them. It's just I've run across this so many times now when I do talk about it, and it's immediately say, "Oh, you're making excuses," but I'm really not. The thing is you just made a point about context. And if we're going to be respecters of reality and we're going to acknowledge fact, we cannot deny the impact that a person's upbringing has on him or her. It's not a necessitating cause, it's not a determining factor, but it is the context within which a person has to make decisions, right? We can't escape that, and we have to acknowledge it if we're going to be pursuers of truth. So that being said, and with the qualifier that it's not an excuse, right? So I grew up with my mother. My parents divorced. I think I want to say I was 3, but I'm not positive. 2 or 3, they divorced, and both of them were heroin addicts. Both my parents. My father was a bad alcoholic, and my mother raised me by herself. But my father, he was in and out. You know, he would come by, he would leave, he would come by, he would leave, that sort of thing. But from a very young age, both my father was abusive towards my mother. My father had a reputation. Everybody knew what a tough guy my father was. From the cops, the kids in the neighborhood, the older kids looked up to my father. And like many kids that want to be like their fathers, I wanted to be like mine. You know, he's a gangster. I want to be a gangster. You know what I mean? And plus the messages that I was told, you don't take shit from anybody, you have to fight. And then as I got older, I mean, I was just told, you've got to be, you've got to be brutal, you've got to be ruthless. So just as an example, a young kid, maybe 3 years old, my father and his friends had been selling aspirin, crushed aspirin, to some guys and passing it off as coke. Now, this went on for months. So, draw your conclusions about the intelligence of the guys that they're selling this stuff for. I mean, too, when you're buying crushed aspirin for coke for months at a time. So the guys come to the house and, an argument ensues. And my mother's out in the yard. And my mother says something to one of them because my mother had a really big mouth. And the guy says, "Shut up, bitch." So my father immediately steps back, cracks the guy in the face. The guy falls down to one knee. He pulls out a 38 and he starts, firing at my father. My father runs. They fire several times. They hit his friend in the leg. His friend's now laid out in my living room. My mother covers me up like this so she can take me up the stairs and protect me. My father comes running by up the stairs, goes under my mother's bed. He grabs his shotgun. He now passes us again with his shotgun past his friend who's laying, in the floor, and he runs outside, and he ends up in a situation where he has one of the gunmen against. Remember, I lived in a project, so the houses are very close together. So he has the guy against the neighbor's house, and my father's got the shotgun straight to his head, and my mother, by this time, comes downstairs and she's telling him, "Billy," that's my father's name, "Billy, your son's in the house. Remember Mike, remember Michael, please don't." And that sort of talks him out of it, and that calms down. So that's just the sort of type of thing,
taste. If you read the book, you've been subjected from practically being a toddler through
Sure.
all your formative years to cuttings and shootings and harsh arguments, people hearing
Yeah.
about people being beaten to a pulp with chains. That sort of stuff is
Yes.
just the background.
Yes.
And then in addition to that, when you yourself would have social issues with your peers, your parents actually encouraged a violent solution. And in
Sure.
fact, would negatively, both of your parents would convey a negative evaluation if you weren't willing to settle problems violently.
Yes. So I'll give you 2 examples of what you're talking about. When I was 6 years old, a friend of mine in the neighborhood, friend, it's funny you call him a friend when I'm going to tell the story, but we ended up being friends. But he choked me. And I went home and I had strangulation marks on my neck. I'm 6 years old. And my mother tells me, "What you do is go hit him with a bottle. Go find a bottle. There's beer bottles all over the neighborhood, all, strewn in the backyards." So, of course, that's what I did. I went home. My mother told me, "Go hit the guy with the bottle." So I went and hit the kid with the bottle. My mother told me to do it. Now, at that age, now I've talked about free will. At 6 years old, I'm not going to say, well, I was, fully volitional and was making my own decisions. At 6 years old, your mother tells you to do something, you do it. So I go, I hit the kid with the bottle. And now, the story, what you're talking about, when I was 13, so my grandfather was wealthy. My grandfather used to pay our rent so that we could stay in the projects. But he died. When he died, there went a month where my mother didn't pay the rent. They had wanted to kick us out for years. And now they had their excuse. The rent went unpaid, so they were able to evict us. So I had to move out of the projects, and I moved in with my wealthy grandmother, the widow of my grandfather. This is my father's mother. The kids in the neighborhood after that turned on me. I can only speculate that it was because they thought maybe I thought I was better than them now or whatever. I moved out. They thought I made it. I don't ultimately know, but that's what I'm assuming. So I was scared. They were going to jump me, and then I was supposed to fight with one of them. So I was afraid I was going to get jumped. So I called my parents. I said, listen, I'm supposed to fight with this kid, and I think I'm going to get jumped. Can you come just to make sure no one jumps in? So my parents come. My mother walks to the house. My father's parked on the street, and my mother says, all right, let's go. So we go, and I'm saying, I'm ready. I'm ready. We get down the street, and I saw the kid, and I chickened out. I was scared. I was never tough. I was a small kid. I'm still small now. I'm only 5'8". I mean, 175 pounds, but I was a small kid, and I was scared. And I told my mother, I said, no, I don't want to fight. And my father says, Michael, get out of the car and beat his ass. I said, no, I don't want to. And my mother just says, I'm so embarrassed. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Now, when to be evaluated like that by my parents was just like, oh my God, this backing down to a fight thing is just horrible, right? It's repugnant. And so I start to hate myself for being a coward, but at the same time, I want to present as a tough guy, which I'm not. And so ultimately, what I do is I compensate, and I say, well, I can't be a tough guy with my hands, but I can be the most ruthless person that anybody around here has ever seen.
It's just
And
aggressive.
yeah, and so that's what I did. I just became excessively ruthless and violent, and I'm going to use weapons and whatever I have to make that name for myself, to earn my father's respect, my mother's respect, whatever I was after. So that's what I did. And, I mean, it didn't really pay off. And it's interesting because I'm going to flash forward a little bit. After my mother passed away, I was on the telephone with my father. And I don't think I talked about this in the book. I may have. But I was on the phone with my father, and he was talking about my mother's, the guy she was married to at the time of her death. And my father says to me on the phone, I'm 31 at the time. I'm in prison. And my father says, oh, yeah, I'm going to go run him down with the car. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You're 50 years old. Mom's dead. Like, let this nonsense go. And my father says to me, oh, this is not my son talking to me. He says, Mike, come on. I know you changed, kid, but come back a little bit. But it's funny because at that point in my life, it was so ridiculous that this guy would suggest this to me, like, because all that desire to seek his approval was gone by then. I mean, I had been reading Ayn Rand for 6 years, and Dr. Stanton Samanow, and I've done an immense amount of internal work in changing my values. So the whole idea, like, we had to beat this guy up, it was just silly to me. And it just occurred to me, like, wow, I really crave this guy's approval for this kind of stuff. He's 50, 3 years old, and he's talking about fighting and hitting someone with a
It's
car. It's absurd.
perfectly normal for a boy to look up to his dad, want to emulate his dad, be dad. I remember I had the exact same feeling. Gosh, if I could be more like dad, I want to be just like dad. Dad's drive, I'm going to drive. Dad does this, I want to do that.
Yeah,
Little boy is going to go through that with dad. Only your dad was giving you, instead of positive moral, modeling, let's put it that way. He was giving you a perverse, upside down, crazy,
sure,
anti-moral modeling. And as you pointed out, you've worked out these things, and we'll get to
sure.
that psychological stuff and philosophical stuff that help build you up. Just a couple more questions on your context.
Can I just point something out real
Sure.
quick about what you just said about kids wanting to be like their
Yeah.
dad? So I don't know if you can see it, but I have a little scar right over in this area. Probably can't see it. Whatever, doesn't matter, but it's there. And the way that I got that was when I was a little kid, my mother had bought me a make-believe shaving kit. because I wanted to be like my dad. My dad shaves, I want to shave. And so to emulate my father, I went to get it, but I grabbed the wrong razor and I shaved and I sliced my chin. And my only point to that is, as a little kid, the pretending to shave because my father did so was as natural as being violent because my father was. Now, like I said, later on in life, we become volitional, we become responsible for our behaviors. But as a young kid, you do what you imitate the people you care about. Especially, I mean, any guy that's watching this knows what it's like to want to be like your dad, right? And that's what I wanted to be like.
Of course, of course. You bring up though a point about imitating dad. There are also psychological things that can happen to us in early childhood if we don't get securely attached with our primary
Sure.
caregivers. And your mom, as you've explained to us, was a heroin addict.
Yeah.
And you explained in the book how there were periods of time when you were a small child, when she would go away for long periods of time.
Sure.
You didn't know where you'd be distressed, emotionally distressed at her
Yeah.
long absences, not knowing when or even if she'd come back. And there were even a couple of instances where you had to cope with at a very young age where she OD'd and you actually overheard conversations about the possibility of her being dead
Yeah.
as a small child. Um, and you don't have to have a PhD in psychology to figure that that's going to result in major fear of abandonment issues,
Sure.
insecurities about attachment with anybody. All of your relationships for the rest of your life, a psychologist would likely tell you, are going to be fraught with insecurities, fraught with, and a very typical version of that is becoming possessive and jealous.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about the impact of that on your life?
Sure. So my mother, like you said, my mother began leaving me home alone when I was 6. And there were days when it would be hours and hours before she would come home. And my father, when I was 9, my father and his new wife beat my mother savagely in the street. Just it was horrific. And I was crying. I thought my mother was going to die then. And then 2 times, and I something tells me that it was in a 3-week span this happened, but I'm not so sure. I just know that both instances happened where my mother overdosed and almost died. And one of the times this happened, I woke up in the middle of the night and the sounds of cops talking and the walkie talkies that they had, you could hear things going off. And I woke up to that. That wasn't the first time that it happened because my house, for people getting arrested, whatever. So I knew something wasn't right when I woke up. And then my mother's friend, they took me downstairs because my mother was in her bedroom. Both our bedrooms were upstairs. We went downstairs and my mother's friend went and got on the phone and I could hear her whisper to whomever she was talking to, "I think Nancy's dead." That's my mother's name. So when I hear that, it's like, oh my God, my mother's dead. And like, oh my God, I never felt anything like it. Not for a long time after that. And it just, my biggest fear, of the culmination of these overdoses and my mother getting beaten up is I just always fear my mother would die. So what ends up happening is when I end up in relationships with girls, I sort of project that. I assume that everybody is going to abandon me. I can't trust anybody, nobody. And my father played a part in that as well because he was never dependable. And so that's just like you said, it's my attachment style. So when you now sort of combine those two elements, the violence, the anger that I'm learning and that I'm implementing in my life, and you combine that with possessive and jealousy. One, I abused my first girlfriend pretty badly. And two, any guys or any thought that a guy was going to take them away or they were going to leave me. And it didn't take much for me to think that. I mean, it wasn't, it would lead to violence. And
Right.
which ultimately culminated in the crime for which I got the most time. I got a 27-year sentence for. I don't know if you want to get into that now or if you want to wait.
You're so I have to say, before we say anything more about this, one of the remarkable things about your book is the simple, straightforward, direct honesty that you bring to this. And as you indicated, your later studies in psychology helped you understand this, and you really did take the time and the effort and the work to do the introspection and figure this stuff out about your own background in
Yeah.
psychology. That's very, very impressive. And in the course of the book, readers will find that you'll describe that how it even affected friendships
Sure.
as you were improving, distinctly improving in the male context of prison. It was
Yeah.
still affecting your
Yeah.
relationships with friends and stuff. Things like that can just have an impact on the way we relate to people for the rest of our lives. It's
Yeah.
remarkable that you even did address that. But yeah, please tell us about the crime. You do describe there are a bunch of other crimes, drugs and theft and minor violence
Sure.
stuff.
Yeah.
But tell us about the crime that got you over
The
20
main
years
the, the
in
main
prison.
crime, I had dated a
Yeah.
girl. We dated for about a year and a half. And while we were dating, she had guy friends, and I ended up assaulting some of them. And this went on, and then we finally broke up, and she ended up with a new boyfriend. So an incident occurs where he had been threatening me actually at this point. And I finally said, okay, I told him, where do you want to meet me? You tell me, I'll go out. My friend and I will drive out there. He tells me, and I had a pistol on me. I had a 32 semi-automatic pistol, and he had the cops waiting for me. So I end up going. I don't think I even talked about this in the book because it's insignificant as far as the sentence I got. So I get arrested for this, and I did a couple months because my grandmother wouldn't bond me out of jail. She wanted me to learn my lesson type thing. So I did a couple months. She bonded me out. A couple months afterwards, the girl calls me up, and we end up going hanging out, and all those old attachments and possessiveness kick right in again. And so I know where she lives now. She's still with this guy. I want her back. So I end up having three of my friends go over there to beat the guy up and to stab him. And she got stabbed in the process, not as bad as he did. I mean, she just, they're in bed next to each other. This is an unwieldy situation and, extremely volatile. So she ends up getting cut in the leg, and he suffered 4 stab wounds. And for that, I received a 27-year sentence.
Someone could have died.
Sure.
And it's as scary a situation as a person can imagine, being attacked by
Sure.
people in bed with a knife. How does that make you feel today, that you were able to do something that bad?
Well, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh my God, I feel so guilty to this day. I mean, the thing is I've processed this stuff, right? I recognize it as horrible. I'm ashamed of what I did. But I'm not going to kill myself for the rest of my life over it. I mean, I spent 25 years in prison. I suffered immensely. I have to judge even my own behavior based on my context. I was 21 years old. I was responsible for my behavior, and I paid the price. And people sometimes, how do I put this? Like, they get upset with me or angry with me because of the straightforward way in which I talk.
Yeah.
And the problem is I've learned from Ayn Rand and from Stanton Samanow in this specific regard even more, to take emotion out of the equation and think logically. And that's how you remedy the situation. That emotions are a function of thought. If you put emotions first, you end up with a disaster. So I speak logically and matter of factly because I've trained myself to do so. And that's how I won't end up in that situation again. Right.
Uh-huh.
I
Right.
understand
Right.
now all the dynamics. I can think logically about it. I understand first of all, you can't control people. And even if you could, it would be wrong to do. Right. Violence, I understand logically, is wrong. And because of that, yes, viscerally, emotionally, I get it. You shouldn't do it. And I do feel bad for a lot of the things I've done, including this. But you're not going to see me, like, I'm not going to break down in an interview and cry about what a horrible thing I've done. I mean, I've spent enough time crying about life and
And
things
it
that
sounds
it's just
like
not
you've
going to
actually,
happen now.
but it sounds like you've actually thought about it and processed it and
Oh,
morally
no doubt about it. Yeah. Yeah.
you actually went through that process. So in
Sure.
effect, you're able to talk about it in an objective way, which is a
Yeah.
remarkable thing by itself.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not like a sociopathic thing where I'm just distanced from everything. It's just
right,
stuff that's all been processed, just like my upbringing. I mean, if people think that I haven't cried over my mother or my
right,
father or things of that nature,
right,
it's just wrong. But
right.
how many times can you shed tears about it once I understand? And by the way, let me just get this out. I love both my parents, but they're at the time of both their deaths, I had wonderful relationships with them. Dysfunctional, don't get me wrong. But the one thing is, my parents both of them always told me they love me. And I have no problem telling people I love them. It's like, it's an easy thing for me to do. And I got that from them. I mean, it's not like it's easy to sort of get lost in the cacophony of chaos, right? When you're talking about this stuff, because necessarily, and that's another reason I don't like it when I have to explain why I did what I did, because I'm not going to tell you about the time my dad took me to wrestling and it was so exciting to, we held up the foam fingers. That's not going to come into the equation. And I'm not going to tell you about all the people in my life that tried to help me, the police officers, the guidance counselors that would try to talk to me and set me aside and say, Michael, you're on the wrong trajectory. You need to do something with your life, teachers, whatever. That stuff's not going to come up, because you're asking me, not you in particular, but anybody that says, well, why'd you do what you did? It frames the subject in such a way that you're necessarily going to hear all the negative. And that's just not what it all is.
Right. You brought this out, especially in a conversation we had the other day. There was a time when you were around 16 or something, where you actually were conscious about making a choice that it be a criminal. I'm going to be a criminal. This is a criminal lifestyle.
Sure.
And there was no doubt that in that early phase of your life, you would describe yourself as having a criminal lifestyle.
Sure. And it wasn't the first time. I remember, I can tell you the day, and it's long before the time you're talking about, that I set my conscience aside. I sought out Hartford kids, that they're the city kids. That's who I wanted to hang out with. That's who I wanted to fit in with. I figured they would protect me if I was ever in a situation where kids like my old neighborhood wanted to beat me up. So how do you fit in with these kids? Well, you do the same thing that I'd been trying to do, is you get ruthless. And we were walking down the street in Hartford, and we came across these kids, and the guy I was with said, let's rob him for his chain. Okay. You know what I mean? I wasn't going to say no. I didn't want to seem like I was scared, right? So we went, we did it, and we beat this kid just mercilessly in the street. 14 years old. We were both 14, and we beat him badly. And I remember going home that night, and I felt awful. I felt so much guilt. I just felt terrible about myself. Like, oh, that poor kid. And deliberately, I pushed that out of my head. I deliberately suppressed the guilt, evaded it, moved it aside, because it was going to get in the way of being what I wanted to be. So, after that, with each action, with each crime, with each theft, each assault, it gets easier every time until it's just as natural as breathing. So the time that you're talking about, I believe I was going to my tutor. I had been expelled from school, but I had to go to a tutor. And I was walking to the high school, to go to my tutor, which was down the street from my house. And I remember the thoughts kicking into my head. You don't want to be this way forever. You've got to change. You've got to become a responsible person, start doing responsible stuff. And again, I did the same thing I had previously done. I just pushed those thoughts out of my head deliberately. I said,
You
human
can even
behavior.
identify volitional moments when you chose not to think about moral
Sure.
issues, chose to go with the emotions that were leading you into
Yes,
a criminal lifestyle.
absolutely.
That's
Probably out
our
of fear. Because, okay, the kids that I'm hanging around, my whole context, right, at this point in time, I think my father was in prison. I was 17, so he was probably in jail no, my father was out of prison. But so I got my father, my mother, my friends. In order to go against that criminal thinking would have required a tremendous amount of courage that I simply didn't have. Again, it's volitional. Like you said, I could have made a different choice. I didn't. I mean, I said, no, I want to continue down this criminal path. I want to be a crook, and that's it.
Okay, it's a volitional choice, but you have a context that, let me suggest, 99% of the folks listening to us do not share. And it's a rather
Sure.
extraordinary context.
And again, I just want to state, Jim,
Yeah.
if we're going to be rational thinkers, right, you have to take everything into consideration. I'm not asking anybody out there, and never to excuse me. There's been people who have been through far, far, far worse than I did and didn't do what I did, right? I'm responsible for my conduct. Okay. But keep the context in mind. I didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what? I think I'm going to turn into a violent animal. Let me just go do this for shits and giggles, right?
Right.
Right. Doesn't excuse it. But if you want to understand, you have to keep the whole context in mind. It's like understanding anything. If you want to understand why water freezes at 32 degrees, you have to keep the whole context, because if you add adulterants to that water, it may not freeze any longer, and you have to understand the context to understand why it's not freezing.
Well, that was a very good explanation. Okay, enough of that. Let's now start down the path towards your intellectual and moral reform. But
Sure.
it immediately that for a good deal of your over 25-year sentence, as I understand it, you were 11 years in one facility, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. But could you tell us about your initial experiences with the Connecticut correctional system, and what they were like, and had you really significantly changed during that period?
Okay, so remember I told you that I went to jail for the gun that time, and I was in jail for, I think, 2 months and 20 days. And during that time, I joined the gang. So this is the reason I joined the gang. Let me show you here. So I've got this. How do I get it so you can see? Okay, you see this tattoo of my dog right there?
Yeah.
Okay, he's a pit bull. So the pit bull was a gang tattoo for one of the gangs. So the guys in prison, when they saw my pit bull tattoo, assumed I was in that gang. That was the gang that they were at war with. So this was going to put me in serious peril. You know what I mean? So I ended up joining that gang, partly for protection, partly because I thought it was cool, whatever, to fit in, whatever. So now I get out, and then I ended up back in jail. So I'm back in jail, and I tell them, now my crimes, none of that had anything to do with gang activity. But when I'm back in jail, I say, okay, let me be in this gang. And when you first go to jail, you're not sentenced, so you're in a pre-trial jail. That's where I was for 6 months before trial. I was dabbling in the gang stuff. I ended up getting sentenced. Now I'm gambling pretty heavily.
Do people realize a lot of I was a prosecutor for 18 years, and so I think I'm aware of some factual context that maybe a lot of our viewers aren't
Okay,
aware of. Drugs, gambling, the existence of weapons, these are commonplace in the state prisons of our country.
sure.
People do not realize just exactly how widespread and common shivs, violence, drug use, heroin use, gambling, lots of gambling, and things like that are going on in state prisons across this country on a daily basis. And
Yeah,
people, and maybe the
sure.
ordinary American isn't quite aware of the prison environment. Um, I understand you were gambling. You were
I
getting
was,
into gambling.
I was, yeah.
In order to maybe pay for that,
Well,
you
that's
had
later. You're getting kind of ahead of us.
smuggling in drugs. But could you give us a little wider context on?
Right. So I'm gambling, and I'm in prison now. And
Yeah,
initially, I'm not getting contact visits because I'm in the pre-trial facility. But once I get to the sentence facility, I'm sentenced now. I've got my 33-year prison sentence,
yeah.
and I'm getting contact visits. And remember, I told you my parents were both heroin addicts. Each of them had done prison time. When each was in prison, the other would bring that person drugs, whether it be heroin, coke, marijuana, whatever, pills. So I said, well, geez, I might as well start getting high. I mean, I'm in prison. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here. I'm 21 years old. When you're 21 years old and sentenced to 22 by then, and sentenced to 33 years, that's life. I mean, there's no end in sight. That's it. It's over with. So I started to do heroin in prison, started having my mother bring it into me. And suddenly I decided to change. And that's, I think, where you're talking about. I started to change, and I had a little context of trying to change when I was on the street. I had been involved with the Amway business for a very brief period of time. But
Sales operation.
yeah, but while I was in prison, I remembered that Amway business, and I remembered there was a teaching system. And as part of that teaching system, they had an abundance of self-help and motivational books. So I contacted the guy who had brought me in the Amway, and I said, hey, I'll pay you for them. Can you send me the books that are on that reading list? And he said, sure. So now I'm devouring self-improvement stuff, motivational self-improvement. And two of the books on that list were Free to Choose by Milton Friedman and The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And those two books
Well, but
were
that's
my,
an thing. You start out with books that are like how to win friends and influence
that was
people,
on the list. Yeah.
yeah, good business person type books, and your
Yes.
motivational books, and that leads you extraordinarily to
Yes.
deep books on politics and economics,
Yeah.
like Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, or The Law by one of the greatest books ever written, The Law by Frederick
Oh,
Bastiat.
sure.
Those are not exactly on the same level as how to win friends and influence people.
No, no,
You
no.
actually, but by going through the most popular self-improvement type books, you actually end
Yeah.
up starting to study serious
Yeah,
economics.
only because they were on the list. I
How
didn't
did
say to
how the heck
myself,
do that though?
they were just on the list. So I ordered them. I just went down the list. And when I got to them, I ordered them. And it wasn't like I said, I want to study political philosophy or I want to study economics. I didn't know that that's what the books were. But when I read them, I mean, I tell people to this day, if somebody said to me, "Give me three books that for an introductory to capitalism," I would tell them read Henry Hazlitt's Economic in One Lesson, Frederick Bastiat's The Law, and Ayn Rand's Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal. You read those three books, and you're on your way to being a hardcore defender of capitalism.
I
So,
agree.
yeah, yeah,
Productions, if you know about the free market.
yeah. So the interesting thing though was on the back of the book, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, was the name of a place called the Foundation for Economic Education. In Milton Friedman's book, whatever flaws Friedman has, that book was a phenomenal book for an introductory to learn the intricacies of in the intention of certain laws and what actually happens and how prices are formed. It was amazing. So when I saw this Foundation for Economic Education, I said, wow, I'm writing these people. So I wrote to them and I said, will you please send me whatever you can, any information you can, just whatever. I want to read it. And they sent me a 1-year free subscription to their magazine, Ideas on Liberty. And I'm just, wow. And by this point, I had a family member, a friend rather, send me to a introductory to the Introduction to the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and Capitalism and Freedom, also by Milton Friedman. So now I've got those two books in my head, and I've got this awesome magazine. In the meantime, I read Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. So I'm just devouring economic stuff. But within that magazine, the Ideas on Liberty was an address for a place called Laissez-Faire Books. And it's interesting how these sort of chains happen, right? Because from these self-improvement books, I get Bastiat and I get Milton Friedman. And from Bastiat, I get the address for the Foundation for Economic Education. From them, I get Laissez-Faire Books. Also, in the meantime, I had read a book called Triumph of Liberty by Jim Powell. It was 64 biographies, mini biographies of people who advanced the cause of liberty throughout history. Within that book was a brief biography of Ayn Rand. And I said, wow, that's, that story sounds amazing. The whole thing with the Isabel Patterson challenging her and everything else. So now I end up getting the catalog for Laissez-Faire Books, and they've got this compilation, right? They've got a box set of books by the people that I've been reading about in the Foundation for Economic Education, Ideas on Liberty. They always talked about this guy named Mises. I pronounced it Mises at the time. So they have his book, Human Action, and they've got Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. So I just bought the box set. You know what I mean? I just bought it, and I've never.
Action, two of the mightiest and most insightful tomes ever written by
Sure,
any.
sure. I mean, in there,
That's the hardcore stuff on the
yes,
20th century classical liberal writers. Those are the most consistent
sure,
defenders of true laissez-faire, and
sure.
their magnum opus.
Yeah. and
Wow.
and and coming at it from two very, very different perspectives,
Yes. Oh,
and each just with logical precision that I just found amazing. And so that's, maybe I've gone a little bit, taking you too far afield, but
well,
that
what?
was
Let's back up just. I want to
sure.
get into all this, but one thing I definitely want to ask you is what was your thinking in terms of becoming something of a scholar? What was your motivation? What when you are becoming you're becoming an autodidact,
Sure.
self-educated. You're systematically now saying, "I'm going to learn." And was there something conscious in your head where you're going to say, no, I want to learn this stuff?
There was,
What
yeah,
down the road,
certainly,
becoming a
yeah.
installer?
Well, the self-improvement stuff I wanted because I knew I was a mess and I wanted something better for my life. That stuff, I just loved it. I loved the logic. I loved to argue. I loved to debate. And this stuff was just giving me ammunition for debates that was incredible. And I briefly took a course on social ethics. I didn't complete the course, but I started it. And I came across this principle of Aristotle's. The guy told us the principle in Western philosophy is that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time. In other words, contradictions cannot exist. So
And this was the discovery of Ayn Rand?
this is before I read Ayn Rand. This was during a social ethics class. I came across that principle and it resonated with me. And I remember guys in the class with me were trying to give counter examples and prove the professor wrong. And immediately I knew I'd never heard that before. And I knew no. Like a guy comes, he came with a marker and he shows the guy the marker and he says, look, this can both be a marker and not a marker because maybe it doesn't work. And I said, okay, but if it doesn't work, then it's not a marker in the sense in which you were referring to before. The point is it cannot both be a working marker and a non-working marker at the same time. So I said to myself, you know what? This is what I'm going to do. I am going to eliminate contradictions from my thinking. So I'm 22 years old and I set out with the goal prior to ever reading Ayn Rand, I am going to eliminate contradictions. And I also read a book, I didn't mention it, called How to Think Straight by Anthony Flew. And it was an introductory to logic, formal logic, not logic in the sense that Ayn Rand uses the term of identifying, facts of reality and integrating properly, but formal logic. And
logic, like
it's just for a basic example, a syllogism. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now it got more in depth like that, but I love the pattern of thinking that this was describing, of logical rigor and understanding fallacies and arguments. I just loved it. I absolutely fell in love.
it is extraordinary to me, if I can just share with the audience one comment here. It is extraordinary to me that when you came to the decision, I want to make my life better, one of the very first discoveries was logic and reason.
Oh,
And
sure.
right, I want to think to get better. I got to think straight, in
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
a remarkable discovery.
Sure.
Like you said, I want to pick up on something else you said. It's not just the books that started pouring in that were interesting, but like you say, you enjoyed debate and discussion,
Yeah.
and people there. In fact, early on, there was someone there who was a socialist that you met, and you started having a conversation. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay. So by the time I met him, I don't know. I had not yet read Ayn Rand or Human Action or Menger or any of the Austrian stuff, but I had read Bastiat, I had read Milton Friedman and Adam Smith, Thomas Sowell, and I had been reading Ideas for Liberty. Now it had been about a year.
So
So
you free market oriented towards the free market.
yes, yeah. And I went to the chow hall in the morning and I was looking around for a table and I found, now let me back up a little bit. I had been in protective custody because of a problem I had with the aforementioned gang. That's important for us to understand. So
Oh,
I had been in protective custody.
it's
And
worse than the population. There's terrible things. It's for your protection, but it's
yeah,
not a very pleasant experience to
no,
go.
it's far more locked down than at least it was. I mean, this is 23, 24 years ago, maybe even more. But yeah, so it was far more locked down than the general population was. And not only that, but ironically, it's more violent. And I speculate, and I still do, that the reason it's more violent is because guys up there have a chip on their shoulder. Everybody knows, oh, I'm going to be looked at as like a coward because I'm in protective custody. So everybody's got something to prove. So there ends up being more fights in protective custody. But anyway, so as I'm headed,
Positivism says we can never be certain of anything, so let's call it positivism.
yeah,
It's protective custody, so let's make sure it's the most violent place in the building.
yeah. So now when I'm going back to population, I made a decision to I just wanted out of there. So I'm headed back. And so I'm nervous because people know I left and some people knew why I left. And so, I'm looking around And I looked for the most unassuming guy I could find when I went to chow in the morning. And I went to sit with him and I said, "Hey, is this seat taken?" And he says, "There's no assigned seating in here." And that turned out to be my best friend to this day. I mean, we started talking. He was obviously a very, very bright guy. He looked like he was in for computer crimes, and everybody figured that's what it was. But it turned out he was in prison for multiple federal bank robberies and shooting a police officer. And you're looking at this guy, and it's like, wow. And at the time, this guy had a reputation in prison, like assault on staff. I mean, it was like, wow, what a dichotomy. Is it, don't ever judge somebody by their appearance. But we started talking. He was very, very bright, and I was impressed with his intellect. And then he told me he was a socialist. And I'm like, oh my God, how are you a socialist? So we start debating.
Bank robbery might come naturally to someone who's a socialist.
Actually, he had quite an elaborate, at that point, justification in that, he thought that it was, it was a rationalization, but he thought that they were all ripoff artists. The banking industry were ripoff artists and whatnot. So we get to talking, and we became friends. Then he transferred out a couple weeks later, whatever. In the meantime, I had changed for a while. So well, I'm not going to say I changed. I had made progress toward change for a while, but slowly but surely I got back into the gambling. Now here's what you were talking about earlier.
So even though you're making some tremendous intellectual progress and even gaining both methodological and some moral insights along the way, your behavior really still hasn't corrected.
Well, it did change for a while. I quit drugs and I quit gambling for maybe a year and a half, about that. I don't know, maybe 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years now that I think about it. But it's easy, just because you change. The subconscious is an amazing thing. The wiring of the brain doesn't just completely change itself right away, and your thinking patterns just don't disappear. And in the meantime, I had lost an appeal. I lost a sentence reduction hearing, so I'm taking some pretty big hits. I start to play cards, and it's amazing how quickly this happens, because I'm playing spades. It's a card game that I'm very good at because I have a good memory, and that's basically what it is. It's remembering what cards have been played. And so then someone says to me, "Hey, listen, I'll put up the money. You don't even have to gamble. Let me just put up the money and I'll pay for you to gamble." Okay, sure. So I do that. And then I said, well, I might as well just gamble myself. So now I'm back to gambling. And then I got into gambling at different games, and I ended up losing a lot of money. Right. And I said, well, what the hell can I do? I can't afford to pay this debt. I'm going to end up getting hurt.
If you owe a bunch of money to people in prison, that can be a pretty ugly.
Yes, it can. But then I remembered, I used to have my mother bring me in heroin. I used to get high. So I said, well, why don't I have my mother bring me in some heroin? I'll sell the heroin. I'll pay my debt, and that'll be that.
That's just your relationship with mom that you're actually kind of comfortable asking mom to smuggle.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about it. Yeah. Listen, it wasn't even a question.
To prison.
Yeah. Just bring the dope. And so, but now I've got the heroin, and I said to myself, well, Jesus, now I got it. I might as well do a little, and the next maybe 16 months I spent doing drugs. And in the meantime, my socialist friend moves to the block. We're still studying. We're debating every day. And he's reading material now. He read Leonard E. Reed's I, Pencil, for instance.
Oh, classic.
Yeah, phenomenal. And he's having trouble answering these things. He really can't. And he read The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand, was sort of the final dagger into his socialist thinking.
Wow.
And so, and now he's on my side in these things. We had been debating, we had been arguing, and I told him, listen, Brent, it's just a matter of I happen to come across this information first. You know what I mean? And that's the part of life.
Here's a guy who did multiple bank robberies and actually shot. So yeah. Probably not going to get out of prison for a long, long time. No. But he is being reformed. Yes. Book on ethics.
Yes, we're studying this stuff together. And in 2004, he and I both made a decision.
Can I just say, pause here? This is an extraordinary story.
Oh, it's awesome.
This is an extraordinary study.
Yeah. And he and I made a decision at the same time. And this is very vital, right? Because people will say to me when I criticize the prison system, oh, well, you were reformed. Sure. I've got 130 IQ, roughly, maybe 125, 100 I30 verbal IQ. That's something most inmates don't have, right? I was fortunate enough to meet a guy that became my best friend, the guy I'm talking about, who went down this road with me, who also has an extremely high IQ. That is not a recipe that you're going to count on to rehabilitate criminals. You know what I mean? It's just not. It's completely fortuitous.
It's so funny because they claim to be a place that's so concerned about reform, rehabilitation,
Sure.
and
And it's just not.
but it's actually counterproductive to
Sure.
that. Did you
Right.
find, well, for example, with drugs or alcohol, did they send you through like 12-step programs,
Yeah. Yeah.
various programs that, again, I'm familiar that they have a bunch of programs.
They do. Yeah. Let me I'll get to those. I want you to hold those in mind though.
Sorry.
Okay. So Brent and I in the same time in 2004 decide we're going to change our lives, right?
So, I got to stop there though. We're stopping each other. But
It's
so,
okay.
or there was actually a self-conscious decision that occurred even after you had this relapse period with bad behavior.
Yes. Yeah.
You get back together with your friend here, who's also smart and reading stuff with you
He
and talking,
is. And he's got a very violent history in prison and out.
and you
Very
guys consciously decide together,
yes.
we're going to turn it around. We're going to
Yes.
make our lives better.
Yes. We did.
Wow.
And armed with Ayn Rand's theory of morality, which we didn't completely get at the time, not even close, but we understood enough that it was based on reason, it's based on reality, and it entails acting in one's self-interest, right? We didn't fully grasp what self-interest meant, the value, connections, and all that stuff, but we got that much. So that was our code. About that time, Brent ordered a book called Inside the Criminal Mind by the late Dr. Stanton E. Samanow, who, with Ayn Rand, if not for the two of them, would not be who I am, and nor would Brent be who he is. And his book was like Inside the Criminal Mind was like reading a blueprint, like somebody had drawn out how I thought. I mean, he just nailed me to a T. I said, oh my God. But he also provided a roadmap for change. And one of the things he said was a criminal in change cannot allow any intentional flaws, any lies, anything. This has to be total integrity 100%, which of course lines up with Ayn Rand's thought of moral perfection. There can be no breach of rationality. You have to stay the course. So what he it was almost as if in retrospect, what he was showing us was a specific narrow application of some of the stuff that Rand was teaching, right? Moral perfection, reason instead of emotion, but not just generally applied, but applied specifically to criminality. So now we have this life philosophy in the form of Ayn Rand. We have this specific guy who's telling us how we think and how to correct it. And we're on our way.
Did you? I just have to ask this because objectivists might find this interesting. Did you know at the time that in the 1980s and 90s that the objectivists were very strongly coming out in favor of Stanton Samanow's work?
I did not know that till about 2 months ago.
Samanow even had a positive view.
Yes.
did,
2 months.
any
2 months ago, 2 months ago, I found that out and I was blown away because it made so much sense, right? So this is what we're armed with. So we now devour everything Stanton Samanow's written, everything Ayn Rand's written, and we're holding each other accountable. And let me tell you something, for anybody that thinks when you're trying to change a habit, right? Try to change one and see how difficult it is. We're changing a lifetime of habits. And that entails having people tell you things you don't want to hear. Who the hell wants to hear you're a coward? I've been a coward my whole life. I thought I was tough. I was a stone cold coward. I'm scared. I have mommy issues. I have daddy issues. I can't even control myself. People are dictating my behavior. I'm getting myself all wound up over the smallest thing. I'm obsessed with what other people think of me. Like who the hell wants to face that, let alone correct it? Funny story. And I know the guy I'm going to mention is persona non grata in objectivist circles, but hey, it's a great book. The Psychology of Self-Esteem, Nathaniel Branden. We get this book, right?
Leading critic of Nathaniel Branden in objectivist circles, am I not?
The biggest of all time.
Just going to tell you flat out, straight up, that I regard The Psychology of Self-Esteem as an extremely valuable book that was important to my own psychological development.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. When Brent read it, it hit Brent so hard. And if he ever gets a chance to see this, he's going to kill me. He's in the middle of this book and we're walking around the block and he gets mad at me because of this, the thoughts that this is bringing out. I mean, Brandon in this book is calling him out on things, evasion and, social metaphysicianism. And you have to develop self-respect and self-confidence. Brent, because I'm the one that bought the book.
Your earned self-esteem that can only be based on rationality and honesty.
Yeah. So Brent's miserable and he's like yelling at me. And I'm like, dude, I didn't write the book. I bought the book. I didn't write it. And we're talking about stuff. And Brent's telling me, the person he's describing, I don't know anyone like that. And he looks at me and he says, and you certainly aren't like this guy that he's described. And I said, Brent, what we're talking about here, we had a discussion. We're talking about ideals. This is something to reach for. It doesn't mean we'll ever reach it, but we can strive to reach it. And as we strive, we'll get better and better. And it's interesting because at the time I didn't fully grasp that, but now I do. And I'm still not where I want to be and maybe never will be. But I'll tell you what, Jim, I'm a hell of a lot closer to what Brandon was describing in that book than I was in 2005, certainly than I was when I was 21 years old.
Oh, my friend, I am perfect, but getting a lot better all the time.
Right. I mean, the attachment issues that you talked about.
But our assessment of our own moral status, including whether we're morally good or morally perfect, has to take into account context.
Sure.
Absolutely. So the point is doing the best we can and still doing the best we can to get better and better. That's not a bad working definition for perfection itself.
We actually, Brent and I ended up developing a program for criminal rehabilitation. In the three thinkers, the book, it says in the introduction, this book is based on the objectivist philosophy of Ayn Rand, the clinical psychology of Dr. Stanton Samanow, and the psychoepistemology of Dr. Nathaniel Branden. And we developed that in 2005. We ultimately got it up and running in 2008.
Wow. So you were not only you were already starting to think about better ways to approach rehabilitating criminals and psychological treatment of criminals based on your own experience and all this reading you're doing.
Yeah. Now back up to what you said about AA and NA, right? Everything that I've learned about criminal psychology, philosophy, personal responsibility tells me that teaching AA and NA in prison is a disaster. It has no place. And that was I don't want to say instinct. That was my conclusion based on what I had read back then. Since then, I've done an abundance of studying on the subject. And it turns out these programs are very ineffective with criminals.
Yeah. The thing is that how are you expecting change when the first thing you tell someone is I'm powerless.
Right.
It's out of control.
Right. Absolutely.
Start out with. Yeah. And the other thing is that quickly along the road, they've got to turn it all over to some quote higher power.
Yes.
Really got to be in charge or you're never gonna and forever life is disease.
Well, that's the other thing, you're not responsible for this.
The ideas that I find counterproductive actually to helping people reform. Agree?
I 100%. You're talking about people. One of the thinking errors that Dr. Samanow identifies that criminals we all have is victim stance, right? So I used to always blame everything, and my mother and my father, this one, that one. I had a friend when I was 19 years old, a girl, she called me up on the phone and I was drunk. And she says, Jesus, you're drunk again? And I immediately went into, you don't know the type of life I've lived, my parents, blah, 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 the whole diatribe. And she said to me then, Mike, how long do you think you're going to be able to blame your parents for your behavior? And at the time, and at the time, I'm like, oh, fuck you. You know what I mean? You don't know what I've been through, Right. But she was spot on. She was dead on. But that's the thing is these programs and AA and NA are by no means the only ones in prison that do that. Whether they're sociological, biological, genetic, they're all excuses hand delivered to someone that's looking for excuses for their behavior. I once sat in on a meeting where a guy said, my cousin who has cancer, he relapsed and no one gets mad at him. Why do they get mad at me when I start drinking again? And I'm just thinking that's so different. One, you have an absolute choice in the matter. You may not have a choice in the fact that you develop this, how do I want to put this? So I don't misspeak. You may not have a choice in the fact that you enjoy drinking, right? But you have an absolute choice in the fact of whether you pick up that drink or not.
Right.
A person with cancer doesn't have that choice.
Current urge to, because you put yourself in this addicted state, but actually picking it up is still a choice.
Yes, it absolutely is. So for that, yeah, absolutely. It's just compared to what I was learning from Dr. Samanow and Ayn Rand, and through the years, an abundance of other thinkers as well. These programs were just the programs in prison were just disasters, absolute disasters.
And so by developing this program of rehabilitation, you're actually self-consciously, you and your friend are self-consciously setting out, in effect, the conditions and almost an implicit program for yourself.
Oh, absolutely. It's the program that we used. Sure. No doubt about it.
Got each other, you've got each other's backs, in effect.
Yeah.
And the vital thing here is not just simply, encourage, but it's the calling each other when necessary.
Yeah.
And in a straightforward way, dude,
yeah.
you're not living up to what we said.
Yeah.
No, well, I noticed you did not. When appropriate, to call the other guy. And it is, in fact, the best, most benevolent, loving thing we can do with our friends like that, if there's this conscious, to call us on our mistakes and to be critical of us.
Yeah.
And that's the best thing a friend can do in that context.
Yeah. And by the way, when this happens, I'm smiling and we're talking about it, but it's not like the guy says, you're doing this, this, and this, and you look at him and say, oh, thank you very much. That's very nice of you. I'll remedy this defect in character right away.
Feel good.
Yeah. This sometimes leads to explosive arguments. You know what I mean? Who the hell are you to tell you? What about you? That's the old patent. What about what you do?
Well, for all your arguments, though, this man became your best friend. This man.
We were cellmates for 11 years. We were in the block together for 16 years and cellmates for 11. Yeah.
And so you say there were arguments, but obviously you had enough mutual respect that you guys actually just got closer and closer.
Brent's his name. Brent has, and I repeat this over and over. Brent has more integrity than any human being I've ever met. It's not even close. I mean, if Brent tells me something, I don't, someone tells you they're going to pick you up at 9 and you think, well, maybe they'll be here 5, whatever. Brent tells me he's going to be here at 9. I don't enter a second thought into it, nothing into it. I know this is going to happen. If he tells me something, it's done. And I don't question it. I don't worry about it, but I put it aside. I have no doubt, Jim, none, zero, as sure as I am that you're having this conversation with me. If Brent and I were together and someone took a shot at me, Brent would step in front of that bullet. No doubt, none.
I have to say, I want to indulge myself in another personal comment. The term we have today is bromance, but that so understates what's really going on here is a spiritual and intellectual and moral relationship you have with this other human being that is beautiful in the way you describe it in the book, and inspirational. It truly is. How you guys helped each other is obviously, and a lot of people will say objectivists, we're, atomistic individualists who live off on our own little islands and stuff, and we don't see the value of other people. Bull BS, I say. And you're a great example of that. How two selfish guys, being ruthlessly honest and objective as you can, are doing the best favor for each other.
Yeah.
And by being ruthlessly honest, by being exactly as you described, it's a wonderful thing that you described there. I just want the audience. That's another beautiful aspect of this.
It's been a phenomenal experience for me.
Yeah, sounds like it. Change didn't come easily or automatically, did it?
No.
But there were experiences you had that allowed you. I want to get back to your intellectual development too here in a minute. But there were experiences you had which actually start reinforcing the idea of becoming principled in your mind and becoming moral in your mind, and that's happening over time. At what point did you say it became inconceivable to you that you wouldn't do heroin or gamble again or become violent again?
I honestly, it's hard to say because it's so long ago, but from the time Brent and I made that decision, it was done. You know what I mean? I knew. Now, mind you, it wasn't like I was making this decision tabula rasa, to use a well-known phrase. I understood what this was going to entail to an extent. I mean, I didn't know how hard it was going to be, but I knew the basics of what it required. I knew I couldn't go back. I knew my value system had to completely change. I knew that I couldn't allow myself fights or violence or anything like that, or doing drugs. So from that point, I mean, there were times, the drugs are relatively easy. The hardest thing, I think, was when you're in prison and you start to do good. Guys know now that they can test you. They know they can push you. They know they can get away with saying things to you, and they do. And those old thoughts don't just disappear. You know what I mean? The old thoughts are still there in the back of my head. I will kill you. You may run your mouth now. I will kill you, not fight, not, I will take you off of this planet, and that'll be the end of it. And that's still in my head. So now those thoughts are there. They have to be challenged. Wait a second. First of all, you're exaggerating the importance of this. You're caring about what someone else thinks. Who cares what that dude thinks? What difference does it make if he thinks you're a punk? Who cares? Does it make it so? And even if it does, so what? Is that the value? Is that a value you want to hold on to? I'll get into a fight in prison. You know what I mean? So all these things constantly have to be changed over and over and over and over again, drilled, because there's constant obstacles.
You
I have
tell one story where you could have told the guards or someone about a situation of violence that was going to occur. You're morally out about that. Should I have done it today? I would have done it. There are moments like that in the book where you see in transition.
Sure. At that time, there was no question about doing the right thing. I didn't care. I mean, in retrospect, I look at it and say, what should I have done? You're talking about a situation where one guy stabbed another. Well, he cut him with a razor blade across down to his throat. Yeah. But, and I knew that these gentlemen were having problems. I knew it for months, and I could have said something, and I didn't. I wasn't the only one that knew. I mean, staff knew, everybody knew, right? Huh?
You didn't warn the potential victim either, although that could have.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, again, it's context. I go and say something. First of all, if I go and tell a staff member, the staff member might just turn around and tell the guy. And you tell this guy that I did that, and I'm the one that's ended up getting hurt. Right. If I go tell the guy that's going to be the potential victim, well, then he is going to go do something to the other guy. So it's not just a matter of see something, say something. You know what I mean? But maybe I end up back in protective custody, because now I'm in danger, and I've still got, at this point, 28 years left on my sentence. So I have all that to think about, and I was friends with both of them. In retrospect, I say in the book, I wish I would have said something, but I also know that it's much easier for me to say that. Well, at the time I wrote it, I was at the end of my sentence, but it's even easier to say now that I'm sitting here having a conversation with the author of The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics than when I'm actually in the block with the guys with the razor blades.
Point is, though, you're opening up your mind to more what can only be described as moral development. You're starting to think in terms of ethics and principles. Sure. Starting to think in terms of what is in my long-term interest, what is the principled thing to do here. I mean, people, when they read the book too, will get an astonishing record of an arc, it seems to me, of moral development that is unlike anything I've ever read. But let's get back now to your intellectual.
Sure.
Because that is a fascinating thing. Your studies in objectivism and economics continue. Criminology and psychology continue, as you've indicated. You studied the rights theory, which is really interesting because, of course, here you are. Your rights have all been taken away because of a rights violation that you did earlier. Sure. And so rights is obviously a natural subject for you to be thinking about in your own context, but you went far beyond that. It's now becoming built into a wider philosophy. Could you describe that, the development of your thinking?
Sure. Well, when I read Frederick Bastiat's The Law, now here's the thing. His argument is it takes place in midstream. And what I mean by that is he doesn't tie it to an ethical theory, and ultimately rights are an ethical concept. Given that, most people accept the idea that punching someone in the face is wrong, that stealing's wrong, robbery's wrong, fraud's wrong, that type of thing, right? So I didn't really, to prove the theory of rights, you need an ethical theory, but just to understand on a sort of common sense level, you really don't. And Bastiat just says, look, people have a right to life, liberty, and property. If it's wrong for you, for one guy to steal from you, then it's wrong for two, three, four. I don't care how many people agree. It's still theft. It's the same thing. And likewise, one person has a right to defend themselves. Two people can agree to mutual self-defense, three, four, and it doesn't matter how many. Mutual self-defense is fine. And it was just, I mean, okay, that's absolutely, if once you accept that, that's probably the way I should have said it before. Once you accept that violence and theft are wrong, his conclusions follow like night follows day. And so from that time, I mean, I just, that was my viewpoint, and it dovetailed perfectly with the economics that I was learning. I mean, Mises, Human Action, the other Austrians, Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, the Friedrich Hayek. I didn't read the complete works, but I read the essence of Hayek and a bunch of the series that was put out of his writings, the debates he had with Keynes, for instance. So I'm learning economics at the same time. I got my associate's degree in paralegal studies, and then I got another associate's degree in psychology, and I'm reading the cognitive psychologist to learn how to alter my thinking as well. And I think that it's important for me to say one more thing about my own sort of character development, because the violence and the drugs and the misbehavior are one thing. The attachment theory stuff ran deep. That is something that doesn't just change overnight. Jealousy, possessiveness, that stuff is deep, deep inside, right? So I ended up with another friend, and Carlos, and I soon noticed myself becoming possessive with him, like wanting to make sure he was going to spend time with me and trying to control him. I became almost like what I've read about Nathaniel Brandon, for instance, where he's badgering people. You better be doing this. But so I'm trying to teach Carlos Ayn Rand and economics and Stanton Samanow, but I'm not giving him the same allowances that I had. Right? I'm expecting him to get it like this. I've told you this, and it's so anti-reason that I want him to just accept these things because I'm saying it. But I'm realizing it, that I'm having these problems. Realizing it doesn't make them go away, so I start to work on it, and I realize the connection. At this point, I realize there's a connection between this and how I grew up, and the neglect in my mother and the fear of death and all that. So I start to work on it. So nightly, before I go to bed, I start drilling it into my head. Because remember now, I've got Nathaniel Brandon, the emotions follow thoughts. Stanton Samanow teaches the same thing. Rand teaches it. The cognitive therapists think it. So I say, okay, I've got to manually alter the way that I think about this thing. So every night, just because my parents acted that way doesn't mean they didn't love me. They had their own issues. The way they treated me is no reflection on me. Just because they neglected me and abandoned me doesn't mean other people will as well. Even if people abandon me, I can still take it. It won't be the end of the world. And I'm drilling this into my head night after night, night after night, night after night. And I learned a big lesson coming up that I'm going to tell you. And that's this, that just because we decide to change doesn't mean that life comes and gives you a big fat kiss and says, okay, great. You've decided to change. You're going to do right. Reward. You know what I mean? Life can still suck and can still be tough. And my mother,
and this, I know I keep coming back to this, but for someone out of prison, dealing with psychological issues, attachment issues, and so forth is hard enough. But you're in an environment which makes it absolutely very difficult and sometimes even impossible to concentrate, introspect.
Oh yeah, with the noise level, it can be insane.
Okay. Didn't mean to interrupt, but I just have to point out that you're overcoming an environment that's not exactly conducive to self-improvement, reading, and introspection.
No, it's not. And luckily, I had Brent and I had Carlos. They're just, by fortune. So my mother, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out she was depressed. I mean, she'd been a heroin addict since she was in her early 20s, and she always suffered with bad depression. And I'm not proud of it, but once I started learning how to change your thinking, I wanted her I'm trying to control my mother. Part of it was, look, my mother's telling me, oh, I've done everything I can for depression. And I know that's bullshit. No, you haven't. What have you done? You went to a psychiatrist and got on meds. You're not doing everything you can, but instead of just letting it go, I've got to badger my mother. So we had kind of a contentious relationship over that. And she was on the methadone program. For those who don't know, methadone is a sort of a substitute, a replacement for heroin or and other opiates that they administer. It's legal, and you go and take it, and it prevents you from suffering the withdrawals from opiates. So she had been on that. And my mother actually was relatively clean off of the drugs for a few years. I mean, she was probably still smoking weed, and she had a Xanax prescription, but the heroin she hadn't been doing. But something happened where she was holding a friend's prescription medication. They found it on her at the methadone clinic. That's a big no-no. They threw her off. So she ends up now, she's back on the heroin because people, you're not going to go through that. People in general, it'd be a very rare soul who's willing to just go through heroin withdrawals and say, I'm just going to take it because I've been clean. And Memorial Day, no, not Memorial Day. I'm sorry. Yes, no, Memorial Day, 2008. It's Monday morning, and I'm going to get up. We had early rec that day because the rec schedule changes. And I say, I'm going to call my mother this morning, as I did most mornings. And all of a sudden they tell me, Liebowitz, they want you down at MHU. That's mental health unit, which was nothing out of the ordinary, except for it was Memorial Day. How I thought about that, I would have known, but it didn't occur to me. So I said, okay, let me get dressed. I'll head down there. So I go down there. Now there was something strange. There's a lieutenant sitting in the office. So right away I know, okay, something's bad. Now my father was always ill. He had hepatitis, cirrhosis of the liver. I always figured he was going to die soon. So I'm thinking, okay, something happened to dad. Oh, fuck, So I go sit down. I say, what? Something bad happened. The lieutenant says to me, listen, Liebowitz, there's no good way to say this. So I'm just going to tell you, your mother committed suicide. And I'm like, oh my God, my mind just went blank. And immediately now the denial starts to kick in, right? I want to ask him, are you sure? Could it have been somebody else? But I know from my studies of psychology that that's what happens. So I immediately trample over all that. And I know, no, this is a fact. So I'm like, oh man. So I call, I say, they say, you want to use the phone? And luckily I remembered my father's number because I couldn't remember any other phone numbers of anybody I knew. They all went blank. And I called my father, assuming he already knew. So I said, hey, Dad, what the hell's going on with mommy? And he says, what do you mean? And now I'm like, oh, Jesus, I got to tell him. So I tell him. Now he lets out a scream that it sent a feeling of, I can't even explain it through my whole body. It was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. So I have to tell him this, and he loved my mother. They were on and off, back and forth all my life, but ultimately that was my father's love. I mean, they were dysfunctional and could,
right.
But my father loved my mother. But here's the kicker of this. So my biggest fear in life always had been my mother was going to die. Right. And I have huge abandonment issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is the biggest form of abandonment. A week before my mother, maybe even less, died, she specifically told me she wouldn't do this because I knew she was depressed. So I asked her, and she said, Mike, I promise you I won't do it. So now what do I do, Jim? Right? Do I let this wreck all my progress? I mean, it hurt like hell. I'm crying my eyes out. I have Brent and Carlos. They're there for me, but it's still, it's a nightmare. And I'm not going to say I behaved perfectly because I did snap on some people. I, could have gotten beaten up had someone not, been less understanding. But I ultimately came to a decision. I said, you know what? I can allow this to wreck me, or I can use it as a stepping stone, because ultimately the worst thing that I'd ever imagined happening has now happened, and I'm still breathing. I'm still thinking. My life is still here. It's not killing me. Why not use that as part of my mantra? If I can take this, there's nothing I can't take. I can move on. I can live. I can thrive in this life. You know what I mean? And
greatest pains of our life, the death of our mother, and in your case, a particularly painful one because you're in prison, be with her at the time.
Sure.
One of the great pains of life into a positive motivation.
Sure. And my mother, I got her suicide note a few months later, and it actually said in there, Mike, I know this is going to be hard for you, but you'll be okay. And she was right. She knew. Ultimately, my mother, and look, I believe in people's right to commit suicide. That hasn't changed. It's not my life.
Knew she had a child who'd be hurt by it. I mean, it is her right, no doubt about it. And she did a difficult, tragic life in some ways.
Yeah.
And she was depressed, but nonetheless, you've got to have this feeling. Mom committed suicide. I was trying to talk to her. She promised me she wouldn't do it, and here I am. That had to be an extremely painful
It
moment.
was, but Jim, ultimately, and this, I say this as sincerely as I can and as logically as I can. And this is why I believe in people's right to kill themselves. My mother was going through horrific things. She knew, okay, if I get back into this heroin, maybe I end up back in jail. Maybe I end up dead. I'm going to end up maybe on the street. I'm stealing for a living. You know what I mean? Going into the store. Like the whole life must have flashed before her eyes. And who the hell am I or anybody else, right, to tell somebody you have to live a nightmare? You have to live a nightmare because other people are going to be hurt if you're not here. And I just don't, I don't have, Brent said to me, well, I think the day of my mother's death, Brent said to me, you've always supported a person's right to commit suicide. Absolutely. That can't change just because I'm hurt by it. You know what I mean? As much as it sucked, as much as I hated it, nonetheless, this was my mother's life. It wasn't mine. And why would I want her to be miserable? Why would I want her to go through that out of some self-sacrificial thing for me? She's going to be miserable, maybe end up back. No, it's her life. She can. Would I rather she handled it differently, got clean and straightened herself out? Sure. But she didn't feel she had the strength to do that. And that's her choice in her life. And it sucks and it hurts. And I miss my mother like hell. But like I said, it's her life, not mine.
So you see, you used it as that pain
Sure.
as a motivational
Yes.
turnaround.
Yeah.
And I do want to get back. How did that specifically? How did that in the aftermath of that? Could you tell us about your development in prison?
Sure. I began to get better and better when my relations with my friend Carlos. I became far less possessive, and I just kept growing, learning it, and kept studying. And Brent and I were running our program on every Tuesday, and we kept growing. Continued to read Rand. We actually decided to write a book, and the book we were going to write was going to be called Ayn Rand and the Rehabilitation of Criminals, because we felt, and this is why the Salmon thing is so interesting. We thought that Rand's theory of ethics and reason would fit perfectly as a corrective for what Salmon was describing, because it had benefited us so much. And we thought, there's inmates, there's some prisoners that are smarter than others, right? I mean, it isn't anything in life. And we thought this type of stuff might benefit those, the people that are looking for something more, that want to be challenged. Ayn Rand's theories, like I said, epistemology, ethics would help immensely on this. So we actually decided to write that book, and we were taking notes, doing research. We read so much. Oh my God. And in the meantime, some things transpired. I don't want to get into now. It's too much, but nonetheless, that chipped away at Brent's resolve to write that book. Not chipped away at his resolve ultimately. He just can't.
Stop for a second here.
Okay.
There are work programs where you can apply for jobs, get jobs
Yes.
In prison, and they're designed to produce an economic product and
Yes.
also to help in the rehabilitation process, develop job skills, develop a sense of responsibility on the part of inmates.
Yeah.
Just briefly, could you describe in your view the effectiveness and morality of work programs in our state prison system?
Okay. Well, you have to understand, in Connecticut, I don't know anywhere else. I can only assume, but I have nothing tells me it's any different. So you end up with a supervisor who's a union guy, right? He gets a job. His job's secure. He can claim he's a master carpenter, anything else he wants. If he can't produce, like our guy's a woodshop teacher, nothing's going to happen to him if he can't. Nobody cares. No one gives a damn. And ultimately, remember, there's always the inmate to fall back on. If things go wrong, you just, come on. I mean, it's inmates. What do you expect? Look at these guys. So it's just like the whole prison system. It's an inverted incentives where you're not incentivized to do a good job. You're not incentivized to have a strong work ethic. You're not incentivized to have character. It's all the opposite. You end up with pressure being put on you to slow down so you can get overtime. The boss doesn't want to be upstaged by you. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things.
Again, to the viewers out there, if you want a horribly vivid description of the corruption of socialism, no greater example, in fact, totalitarian socialism, no greater example can be found than in these work projects. I mean,
Yeah.
I am from California, and I can tell you this is generally the case across America. Connecticut is not alone in this.
No, I know it's not, but from my
But
personal experience, you know what I
also,
mean?
not only do you draw out it's the inevitable result of socialism part, but also the psychological and moral issues. You've got
Sure.
Brent there really trying to do a good job. Brent there really putting some work into it. But at the end of the day, if and when it ever finally does get noticed, the better work is being done. He is specifically not the one. It has to be
Sure.
collectively shared credit,
Yeah.
and he
Now
doesn't.
I have to tell the story, Jim. Now I have to tell the story.
It made an impression on me. I wonder if you
Okay.
could tell that story.
All right. So first things you have to know is Brent is a master carpenter. I mean, Brent is a wizard. When I say wizard, I mean wizard. This guy is just incredible with the stuff that he can do, the things that he can make. And not only is he incredibly talented, but he's got a work ethic that, I mean, when we ended up writing the book that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, Brent would write for sometimes 12 hours a day. I mean, and this isn't, you're not at a comfortable desk with a typewriter. You're sitting on a bunk with your legs crossed with a pad and a pen, you know what I mean? Right in this thing with the noise that we talked about before, you know what I mean? So, but anyway, so this job, because Brent was so good while we're working in the wood shop, they were able to get better jobs, more complex jobs. And Brent would do the drawings because he also can draw blueprints. Phenomenal, right? So Brent ends up drawing this. It's called a flow station. But if you go to a library, the desk that they have that kind of wraps around everything, and you've got the person here, the person there, whatever. So that's what it is. And
A
this
flow,
flow station, yeah. And this thing is just gorgeous when it's done. Now, for the most part, Brent worked on this alone. Brent designed it 100% by himself, built it primarily by himself. Now, sometimes you've got 4x8 pieces of plywood that need to go through a table saw. So he needs a guy to catch it at the other end. Like I say, I think, nailed or put a screw in here and there, but none of my, no intellectual contribution from me or anybody else went into this thing. Certainly no artistic, no intellectual, and very little labor. Right. But if a guy works on it, the guy has to write on his sheet at the end of the day the jobs that he worked on. So he's going to say, I worked on that, 5 minutes, whatever. Okay. So flash forward now. The people that, I don't know if they own, I don't want to say own the library because it's a town thing, but the town council, whatever, whoever's paying for this to be done for the library is so impressed that they want to put a notice of accomplishment or recognition in Brent's prison file to say what he did. Phenomenal, right? The big boss says, no, you can't have an individual accommodation. That's the word I was looking for. You can't have that in your file because you didn't work on this by yourself. He says,
work.
Yeah, Jim, sometimes you're coming in or out, in and out. I can't hear you clearly.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I haven't wanted to say it because I don't want to interrupt the talk, but it just happened now, so I didn't catch what you said. But so he says this was a shop job. It's like for those objectivists out there, it's like the 20th century motor company, right? This was a shop job. Everybody that worked on this job has to get credit. Everybody who worked on this job needs to get this accommodation in their file, including me, by the way. I maybe worked 5 minutes on this thing. Brent, put probably 24 hours of drawing into this thing, and then who knows how much physical labor. So Brent says to the boss, look, this thing could not have been built without me. Nobody else put the sweat or the physical, the intellectual or the sweat into this thing that I did. I'm the only one that deserves it. The boss, unyielding. Nope. Everybody's got to get it. So Brent tells him, you know what? Then I don't want it.
Yeah.
So you end up with the absurd ending that the only one in the shop who doesn't get the certificate of accomplishment is the guy that actually deserves it.
deserved at most.
Right. Now, take that one story and just extrapolate it day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and that is prison. That is the effect that prison has. It is so
So
demoralizing.
thinking about justice or honesty or doing a good job or gaining earned self-esteem or all these other wonderful rehabilitative things, we're learning just how unfair it can be, and we're
Right.
discouraging people psychologically. We're
Right.
demotivating them in any way we can, and that's supposed to be a form of rehabilitation.
Right. Yes.
As perverse as a person can
It
imagine.
is. You do right, you're punished. You do wrong, you're rewarded. That's as easy as I can put it. Day after day, month after month, year after year. And so back to the book we were going to write on Ayn Rand and the rehabilitation of criminals, Brent ends up ripping this whole thing up. And I'm like, oh, geez, how this work. So Brent says to me, Michael, he said the context isn't right for this book. He says, until the prison system changes, it doesn't matter what we write about programming, because you can't have a guy that comes and takes our program for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is a week, and then he goes back to that environment, because everything he learns here is going to be undone by the lessons he's learning on a daily basis in the prison system. And from that, Brent decides to write our book, Down the Rabbit Hole: How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime. And that's the book I was talking about, that he just, I mean, you talk about yeoman's work. I mean, this guy was just insane on this thing. He was just, I've never seen anything like about it. The only thing, Jim, I want to tell you, and again, the objectivists out there, and I told Brent at the time, what it reminded me of watching Brent work on this was Hank Reardon working in the steel mills. That, and I told Brent at the time, I said, this reminds me of Hank Reardon. I said, that's what you're reminiscent of. And Brent looked at me and he said, that is a tremendous compliment that you've just given me. He wasn't, oh no, not me, I don't deserve it. He knew he deserved it. He knew it. And that's why it meant so much, because, he was recognized for it.
Yeah, but you guys have this experience showing what a negative thing is going on, how counterproductive, how anti-reform, how irrational, how corrupt this system is. Furthermore, before we get to rabbit hole, I wanted to ask you a little bit more. Tell me about CEOs.
What about them?
Well, how do they reflect upon, let's put it this way, the justice or injustice of our state prison system?
Well, I don't have to tell you anything about COs. Let me just put it to you this way, right? You've got a situation where you've got a state job, you've got employees that are unionized, so they can't be fired. Everything that they do literally takes place behind closed and locked doors, out of public view. And the only people likely ever to complain about them are the people no one cares about and everyone thinks deserves whatever the hell they got. So if I tell you that, what do you think you're going to get? I mean, that's your incentive structure. Right? So
Cheated rules violations, corner cuttings, and various corruption.
Yeah, a full third of the rules are never reinforced, right? The ones that are reinforced haphazardly, very inconsistently. A lot of the times they're weaponized, so the CEO doesn't like you, so now he's going to enforce a rule that never gets enforced. That's just the way it goes. I mean, it's just
Okay, so armed with a ton of information about how bad the state prisons in Connecticut are, Brent is devoted to writing this book, and he wants to get you to help him to write the book, but you're initially reluctant.
Yeah, I'm reluctant. Like I said, I'm a coward. I'm a small guy. I don't want to get beat up. There's a lot of big guys in prison. And you're talking about, to be honest, we've got to talk about the inmates, the lack of rule enforcement, guys getting away with murder, the gambling, the noise making, all the stuff that inmates are doing wrong that's not being punished by the staff. So we know we're going to piss off everybody. We're going to piss off the inmates. We're going to piss off the staff. Everyone's going to be mad at us. And I'm thinking, they might kill us. We might get beat up. And so one of my favorite conversations ever.
Name names, right?
Oh, we have to name names because the stuff we're talking about is on camera. So
publisher rejected it for fear of defamation, libel type.
Yes, yes. Even though what we're talking about is true, they're afraid. And the thing is this, right? So our word as convicts is garbage, right? To the general public, we can make any claims we want, but it's a lot more difficult for them to call us liars when we say, okay, this happened on this date at this time in this place and the camera's on it, go check.
Kind of needed to be
Right.
specific.
Yes, we had to, because otherwise we have no credibility.
And you could irritate a violent inmate, the staff could learn the
Everybody.
other way, and something
Yeah.
horrible could happen.
Yes. So that's what we're going. So I go to Brent, and Brent approaches me when he wants to write this book, and I don't want to do it. I'm scared. I know he's right, but at the same time, I'm just like, it's not worth it, man. Like, and plus nothing's going to change likely. Right. And Brent's adamant, and he's my friend and I love him. And I said, all right, I'm with you, man. I'll help you. Whatever, let's go. Let's do it. And I told him, when the book's actually coming out now, and I'm like, oh God, the inmates are starting to get mad. The staff's mad. And I said, Brent, I'm scared now. I'm with you, dude. You're my best friend. I'm with you, but I'm scared. And he looks at me dead in the eye. Now, I said I'm a coward. Brent's not. Right? So Brent looks dead in my eyes with an attempt to console me. He says, Mikey, I'm gonna tell you something. The chances of dying from getting stabbed are very slim. I said, what the fuck kind of pep talk is that?
Yeah, well, okay, most stabbings don't result in death, but
Yeah.
percentage of them do.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, so what if I don't die? I don't want to get stabbed. When I said
you say you're a coward, but you did do considerable work on the book, and you did put your name on it.
Sure, and kept doing it.
I think you're maybe being a little harsh on yourself.
Yeah, I get the irony, and ultimately what it is when I say coward is I get scared very easily.
But the truth is, you did help him quite a bit, and
yes.
You guys did come out with it with both your names on it.
Yes, and not only that, but Brent was transferred shortly thereafter, so I stayed in that prison for a year by myself. And then I got a gig talking on the radio about the prison system.
Right. I wanted to ask you about.
And I can't stop. I've got to keep telling the truth. The only thing was an officer I knew and liked that liked me said, Mike, I'm going to tell you what. He called me Lieb, not Mike. He said, Lieb, if you mention names, they're going to shut you down. But if you don't mention names, there's nothing they can do about it. Fine. So I'm on the radio and guys are getting pissed off. And one of the first interviews I do, the guy says to me, so describe prison in a nutshell. If you could implement, what would you do to fix it? But be brief. You're doing 15, 20-minute interviews on the radio. You don't have time to launch, into a diatribe. So I said, I would say more programming, less play. Now the inmates are mad that I said less play. And this went on and on and on. But the irony, Jim, is when I got transferred and I tried to close a different prison, and I had the voice and I was doing the interviews when the COVID policy when what they were doing made no sense at all. Now the inmates love you.
But insane what was going on during COVID. You give a bit of a description there, and it sounds like it was a house.
Yeah, it's like they took a class. It was so bad that the inmates thought they were doing it on purpose to try to get us sick. And I told them, you're giving these people way too much credit. It's like they're not that smart. I'm just like, do you see these people on a day-to-day basis? They don't have the intelligence to come up with that type of a scheme. They just don't. I've heard Napoleon said it. I've heard other people said it, but there's an old saying, never ascribe to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. And that's what we had, incompetence writ large. But, a lot of the inmates loved that when I would talk about what was happening with the COVID policy and whatnot.
Wow. Okay. So again, Mr. Coward, you not only help write the book, you not only put your name on the book, but now you're going out and publicizing the book.
Yeah.
No, you're being courageous about your courageous.
It's funny. When the book came out, the staff used to call me the book guy or the author. Then once I was on the radio, then they would call me, you're the radio guy. You're the radio guy.
Yeah, the radio guy.
Yeah.
You sort of leave us with the book. You're still, in other words, what I really want you to do now is give us kind of a postscript. Can you tell us what happened after prison? First, how you got out of prison and what your life has been like.
Okay. Well, I ended up, I got a sentence reduction. I actually got two. The first one, the prosecutor agreed to. The second one, he opposed me on. But I had so much support in the community. I mean, I had a former state senator who was the tough on crime senator. I had a conservative blogger. I had a popular conservative talk show host. A former police officer from my town spoke for me. So many people just came out for me. I was honestly, I was overwhelmed. Like, it was just an amazing experience. Like, even had they denied my request for a sentence reduction, it would have been worth it just to see that kind of support, because I never had that in my life. But it showed me what character can do. That when you don't immediately get rewarded for doing right. It doesn't work that way. But there's a tendency. There's no guarantees, because people have volition, right? And plus, there's the accidents of nature. Anything can happen. But there is a tendency when you do right to be rewarded. So I got out of prison, and my friend moved me in with him. Subby, phenomenal friend, Subby Scalora. Let me put him out there. Great friend, great guy. That's who I live with.
Well,
And he tells me immediately when I get out, he says, "Look, I don't want you going to work." What do you mean? I got to get a job. He says, "Michael, listen, your future is not in doing landscaping or working at a diner. Your future is in doing talk radio, podcasting, communicating ideas." He said, "I want you to put forth all your energy along those lines, and everything else, you're fine. Don't worry." He said, "If the time comes and we need you to get a job, I'll tell you. But for now, I want you to work on this."
what a great opportunity and what a benevolent guy.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. And, so my first step is I start booking people for the radio show that I used to be on, because I know all the names, right? All the thinkers that I've been studying. So I start booking it. And now I'm booking people that I read about for this show. And then I'm told, you need to get on social media. I didn't want to at all. Like, I'm like, I do not, that's a madhouse. I do not want to be involved with that crazy. But I'm told you have to. So I get on there, and I end up making some connections, and I make a connection with someone who says, "Listen, I'll produce the podcast for you, put together a podcast." But now I also have the list, right, from all the contacts I made when I was booking. And some people said to me, "You're doing that for free? What are you, crazy?" And I said, "It's about planting seeds, right? You have to be willing to do the work first." This I got from all those motivational books I read, all those success books. You do the work first, you plant the seeds, right? So I get on Facebook, and I get that person. And also I'm sending out friend requests, right? Professors, economists, philosophers. That's what I'm doing. All the names I know, and they're accepting. So now I start sending out. I'm like, okay, I haven't done an episode yet. Let me start seeing if I can get people on the show. And again, people whose work I used to read in prison. David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son. We mentioned Free to Choose. He's my first guest. It's incredible to me. Absolutely.
Here, you've had interviews with Harry Binswanger, Jerome Brook, 2 interviews with me. So you're interviewing objectivists, but you're also interviewing some legal scholars.
Richard Epstein. It's just how
phenomenal.
Yeah, how helpful people have been. It's amazing. I actually got a message on Facebook prior to ever talking to you, and somebody told me, you need to talk to Jim Valliant. That's who you have to talk to. He's the guy. Okay. And it's like, what's this guy going to say? I'm going to send Jim Valliant a message and say, I'd like to talk to him. What's he going to say? No. Okay. So what? He says no. He says no. But you didn't. You said, look, I'm really busy right now, but I'll talk to you. And it was interesting because in the meantime, I start getting attacked. I don't like the word attacked, but I start getting assailed on Facebook for some of my views by objectivists, non-objectivists. You shouldn't be talking to this person, or you shouldn't have this opinion. You shouldn't say that. And one guy actually said to me, he says, why would you state your disagreement with Ayn Rand on that point? Because you're risking censure. And I'm thinking, censure, dude, I spent 25 years in prison, right? Like, what do you think? I'm worried about being censured in a Facebook chat room? Yeah, yeah, you shouldn't hold that point of view. And I'm thinking, how ridiculous is it? I've told you I agree with probably 95% of what she said. I disagree, and and you've disagreed with me, and we've had debates about it. The stuff I disagree with her about is like in this narrow scope. The
I
fun
mostly translation issues. I would say they're interpretive issues mostly that you have. You say we can get into this a little bit if you want, but the idea that you can't think for yourself, or that any disagreement with Ayn Rand should get you socially sanctioned, is absurd to me. Now, I do believe there are people out there who are real enemies, dishonest and hostile to objectivism, and we have to be careful not
and
to
I
sanction.
and I agree with you there, by
But
the way.
everyone's got their own learning. If
Sure.
anyone proves that, certainly you prove that.
Sure.
It's got their own learning arc that we need to respect.
Sure.
The idea that we can't associate someone who's got different views than us, that strikes me as anti-objective.
And let me just, just for those of you who don't know out there, we don't have to go into a big thing. Read the book if you really want to know what I think. But my disagreement, metaphysics, I'm with her 100%. Epistemology, there's no light between us. 100% on epistemology. Standard of value, 100%. The virtues, 100%. Implementation of the virtues, that there needs to be an intellectual and an experiential component. 100%. Her conclusions about what should be illegal and what should be legal. 100%. Initiation of force as the ultimate evil. 100%. That the nature of government and purpose of government is to protect rights. What those rights are. 100%. What I disagreed with her about was partially I disagree with her definition of value. I don't think it encompasses her whole theory, which I think is correct. I think her theory of value and her theory of ethics is correct. I just think she should have expanded her definition of value. So I disagree with that. And evidently that was enough that should get me ostracized, thrown out of the club. And then I disagreed about when rights become implemented. Leonard Peikoff said that they don't become implemented if you're interacting with people on a desert island. You first have to have a social unit, an organization. I disagreed. I said, no, rights come into play the second you start interacting with other people. That's when rights come into play. And evidently those disagreements that I have with her are enough to get the ire of some people.
Disagreements, because in one sense you're absolutely right. The same concepts and the same moral principles that we use in rights thinking would be required the second you have a second person. You're Robinson Crusoe alone on the island. You introduce Friday.
Yeah.
Once you introduce one other person, the same moral considerations generally kick in. In other words, the basic idea about rights is kicked in. But what I think all Leonard was saying there is that we don't need a legal system if it's just random, sporadic interaction. You do need more regular social interaction. And it's only in that regular social interaction that we need a code of procedure, a code of evidence.
And I agree with that. And Jim, here's the thing, that come to find out that a lot of these clarifications or when I brought these, opinions to top-notch objectivists. I mean, I'm not meeting some guy who read Atlas Shrugged and went to a conference. It turns out that a lot of things have been clarified in private conversation.
Yes.
That I never had the benefit of. I'm sorry.
This distinction between Ayn Rand, just as a dictionary can give more than one definition for the same concept, even though they're related, closely related. Sure. So I think we have to say the same with value. Ayn Rand does say we have to consider value first in the most general, even in a subjective sense. It's that which people act to gain or keep. But I'm only going to use, when it comes to objective human values, the term value, especially the word good, when it meets her standard of value. Yeah. And so in a sense, she uses value in two different senses.
And only defines it to one. And that's what my issue was. That's it. That's it. And if somebody's going to not like me because of that, then don't like me.
At best, you pointed out an ambiguity in Ayn Rand.
Sure.
That clarification, it would seem to me. And I think she does make it clear that there's these two senses in another way. So when I say it's a translation issue on these issues, one issue, and I'll say this on a podcast for all the world to hear, one issue where I think we kind of agree is that consent of the governed is not the source of legitimacy of government.
No.
Theoretically, you have 10 people in a room, 9 of them agree to beat up the 10th. The fact that you got a 90% majority doesn't make beating up the 10th legitimate, does it?
No. And if 9 of them agree to have a self-defense agency and he won't get into it, and then he tries to attack one of them, they have every legitimate right to he doesn't have to consent for them to defend themselves. Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly right. Yeah, both of those points need to be made so that people don't confuse. But Ayn Rand does say that the authority of government comes from the consent of the governed. And if you think about a representative democracy, that's partly true. Now, I think the real reason why we have representative democracy so that we don't have to have civil war all the time.
Sure. Listen, as an empirical fact, Jim, I would say there's a tendency for the majority consent has to be at least implicit. The problem is Leonard Peikoff says we're not talking about irrational consent here. The authorities derive from rational consent. And that's where that changes it from
I want to rescue Peikoff a little bit. Once you have a system that basically recognizes rights, we'd still have a representative democracy to do the implementation and make the specific rules. And so in that sense, it requires that is the rational consent. So in a government, so the first we're saying is just what we're saying. Rights are the most important thing. And that the application of consent can only really be understood when you've got a rights-respecting government, because democracy, non-rights,
as an empirical statement, I would agree. As government legitimacy, I would say.
Well, would you say that it is? Let me ask you this then, since we're to have these kind of conversations of our conversation here. Would you say that if a system were not a representative democracy, all other things being equal, is it more or less legitimate than, say, a monarchy?
What I believe with all my heart is if a government is limiting itself to protecting the rights of the people, I don't care what form it takes. Now, I think I think that voting, separation of powers, a republic, all the stuff that we have, the form of government has a tendency to do better at protecting rights. Because if the people are jealous of their rights, they'll keep politicians who are going to protect those rights.
The Constitution can protect us. It is the attitudes of the people that are the best.
So I wouldn't care.
I mean, people lost the consent of the governed, say, on the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so we've lost that part of our Constitution because the authority of the government, in fact, comes from. But more than that, I want to talk about rights. Let's theoretically consider a generally rights-respecting government. You wouldn't care whether it was a monarch or an oligarchy or a priesthood.
Let me just be clear, because we're in a high level of abstraction here, and we're not talking about something that actually exists, right?
Right.
But if the government actually protected the rights of the people and was committed to do so, and we could have some kind of magic foresight, and this is what I mean by, we're dealing in fantasy partly, but we're using it to make a point. I generally don't like to do that, but if we had assurances that it would stick to protecting rights, I couldn't care less what the form was. As long as rights are protected, that is what matters.
And your discomfort is where we agree, because it seems to me that a monarchy will inherently be in opposition to rights protection.
Yes.
There'll be monarchies, unlimited democracies will have this tendency too.
Sure.
But so long as it's a highly, hog-tied representative democracy.
Yeah. By the way, our representative, which was never meant to be a democracy, has had the same effect. And it's like you said, ultimately, unless you have a people that respects rights, you're screwed. That's what it needs to be.
So Ayn Rand's technical statement that the authority of governments depends on the consent of the governed.
If it's as an empirical statement, as a factual matter, yes. If you're talking about legitimate authority, no.
So it would be no less legitimate for you for a dictator so long as he was respecting rights.
Yes. As long as rights are respected, it does not matter.
You see, I would say that the process might affect outcome in such
I
a way.
agree it would. I agree it would. I'm only saying that when you say it depends on consent, this is the problem. I'm probably going to have to send you another link because we're running out of time.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to give people a taste.
Yes. So, but let me just say something real quickly on this.
Brilliance.
Can I say, Jim? Can I tell you what my problem is? And this will be a taste, and you and I can get into this on a future podcast.
Okay.
If you say that government's legitimacy is dependent on consent, you open up the door to these ridiculous secessionist movements where every guy says we can secede and start our own little agency, our own little this, our own little that. And they simply cannot do that. If the government is not violating their rights, you have no legitimate reason to withdraw your consent. And so I don't care if you consent, you're bound by the fact that we're respecting rights.
And that's why Leonard's rational consent would be the only way to understand it in the objectivist context.
Yes.
I agree. I think we much more agree than disagree on this.
Oh, absolutely.
I wanted to indicate so that the audience out there can realize that even where you have what you call disagreements with Ayn Rand, you're a brilliant, insightful person who's put his finger right on certain issues that were themselves questions for me. And so all my objectivist friends out there, whatever you think of Michael, I went through every single one of these issues in a way similar to Michael, even if we at the end of the day disagree. And those kind of disagreements, ladies and gentlemen, that can be honest and reasonable minds can differ on. So please give Michael don't be a religious dogmatist and dismiss this work that you will gain tremendous value from reading. I think there should be more memoir by people who've been influenced by Ayn Rand, because these are exactly the sorts of stories that I think really can show the power of ideas. As I've said before, and this is, I think it's the final thing I want to summarize it with is, yes, as an objectivist, I know that free will is axiomatic level knowledge. Either you know from the inside that thinking takes effort and that you have a control over your mental focus, or you don't. You know it from the inside out directly. But if it could be something that would be validated through inductive or logical inference, my examples would at one side be, yes, of course, Michelangelo and the creative extremes of human achievement, but it would also come from physically handicapped people, or people who had incredibly brutal childhoods like yours, where you would expect, you'd almost be able to predict a lifelong of tragedy of one form or another, given your childhood. And frankly, as a prosecutor, I read thousands of forensic psych reports, thousands of probation reports. I went to state prisons in California for the district attorney's offices to do the parole hearings for people with life sentences, because we always wanted someone there for those. So I have reports on these people. Given your background, it is extraordinary, just in terms of a statistical matter. Individuals are not statistics. Free will transcends statistics.
Yes.
You are an example of that. And what makes it so extraordinary is the huge, breathtaking arc you made, as you say, to moral crusader, all the way from being a criminal, a convict. So that, ladies and gentlemen, you will be inspired. Do yourself a favor here. Read this book. It is inspirational. And if anything could inferentially prove volition, it's Mr. Michael Liebowitz.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. And there will be a link attached to this to purchase the ebook. The book's not out in print yet. Will be soon. But Jim, before I go, I want to say this. You asked me what were some of the effects of getting out of prison, right? And there's been immense. This whole podcast thing has been amazing. But the very fact, the friendship that I've developed with you, and I'm putting our business out there a little bit, but you and I have become friends. The fact of all the work that Brent and I did inside allows me to be friends with you. And that is, to me, what it's all about. That is amazing. Now, the clock's going to shut off on me, Jim, so we have to go. But I'll say this. He's Jim Valliant. You know where to find him. He's everywhere. Just look him up. For now, this is The Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Liebowitz signing out. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.